He was already dead before he knew it. Not physically, not obviously, not in any way the room could see. But something had ended, something quiet, something private, something that lived only in the space between what a man believes about himself and what is actually true. And the strange part? Nobody told him. Nothing changed. The air in the room stayed the same. The people around him kept their posture. The conversation didn't break. Nobody flinched. Nobody corrected. Nobody even looked up. And yet, in that one suspended moment, barely a second, barely even a breath, everything he thought he knew about himself became a question he couldn't answer. This is a story about that moment. Not the dramatic kind. Not the kind that gets written about or retold at dinner tables. Not the kind where someone stands up and delivers a correction so clean it cuts the air like a blade. This is the other kind. The kind where nothing happens, and that nothing becomes the loudest thing in the room. There was a man once, not famous, not obscure, just certain. The kind of certain that doesn't need to announce itself. The kind that walks into a room and simply assumes the shape of the space. He had spent years building something in himself, a fluency, a vocabulary that felt natural, a way of moving through conversation that felt earned. He wasn't performing. That's what made it convincing to others, and more dangerously, to himself. He had studied, not casually. He had read the right things, practiced the right things, been around the right people long enough to absorb something real. And what he absorbed felt like understanding, felt like knowing, felt like the comfortable weight of a man who has done the work. He had reached the point, and most people know this point, even if they've never named it, where explanation comes easily, where the words arrive before the thought is even finished, where you no longer search for what to say because it simply comes. That's the moment. Not when you're struggling, not when you're uncertain, but when you've stopped checking because you think you don't need to anymore. He was in that place, that easy, settled, entirely convincing place. And then Bruce Lee walked into the room, not dramatically, not with the weight of a name that carried all the things that name carried, just a presence, a body in a space, a stillness that didn't demand attention. He took his position and said nothing. The other man kept talking. Same tone, same measured cadence, same quiet confidence that had been working since before Bruce Lee arrived. And that's exactly where it started. Not with a correction, not with a question, not with a gesture or a glance, or any of the things that usually signal something, just a presence. Still, unread, unconfirmed, and for a while, maybe 30 seconds, maybe a minute, everything continued exactly as it had been. The words kept coming, the room held its shape, and Bruce Lee simply stood where he was, watching, in the particular way that made watching feel like something more than watching. It's difficult to describe what that kind of attention does to the air in a room, because it doesn't do anything visible. It doesn't change the temperature or shift the light or make any sound that interrupts what's already happening. But something moves, something in the peripheral space, that soft, barely conscious layer of awareness that runs underneath every thought you're having, begins to register a signal, not a problem, not a threat, not a correction. Just something is present that wasn't accounted for. And the mind, that infinitely strange instrument, can't help but notice. The man kept talking, but somewhere in the machinery of it, somewhere between the rhythm of his sentences and the steady flow of his certainty, something tiny shifted, a beat that arrived half a second late, a word that didn't land with the same weight it usually carried, a pause, almost invisible, almost entirely internal, where before there had been none. He didn't know why. He kept going, because there was no reason not to. The room hadn't reacted. Nobody had signaled anything. Bruce Lee remained exactly where he was, doing nothing that could be named as a response. And so, the man adjusted, not consciously, not deliberately, but in the way that bodies adjust when something doesn't feel quite right, even when the mind insists that everything is fine. He added more detail, more texture, more reinforcement of what had already been said, not because the room needed it, but because the certainty had developed a very small crack, and certainty, when it cracks, instinctively reaches for more material, more words, more explanation, more of the thing that felt solid a moment ago. He was trying to rebuild something, without admitting it needed rebuilding. Bruce Lee didn't move, didn't lean in, didn't raise an eyebrow, didn't do anything that a camera could capture or a memory could later replay and say, "There, that's when it changed." He simply remained, unchanged, unresponding, unconfirming, and the absence of confirmation became its own kind of weight. Because here is the thing that doesn't get talked about enough. Most people don't realize how much of their certainty is borrowed, not built, not earned from the inside, but borrowed from the reactions of others, from the nods that come at the right moments, from the eyes that follow when you're explaining something, from the small, constant, almost imperceptible feedback that the world gives you when you're on the right track. Take that away, not aggressively, not by contradiction or challenge, but simply by being present in a way that doesn't offer that feedback. And something very interesting begins to happen. The structure starts to feel external, like a coat that was never actually sewn to the body, like something that fits. Yes, but fits because you've been standing still, and the moment you move, you feel it shift. That's what was happening. The man could feel it shifting, not falling, not breaking, not collapsing into anything visible, just moving in a way that hadn't happened before. And because it was happening in the presence of Bruce Lee, in the presence of something that didn't comment, didn't correct, didn't offer the small mercies of a confused face or a questioning look, it became a mirror, the cleanest kind, the kind that shows you exactly what's there. No softening, no framing, no story around the image, just what is actually present in this moment. He kept talking, but he started listening. That's the shift. Not dramatic, not sudden, but absolute. Because once a man starts listening to himself, truly listening, from the outside, the way a stranger would listen, the voice sounds different. The confidence he heard in his own words moments ago began to carry something else underneath it. Something that sounded less like certainty and more like habit. There's a difference. Certainty comes from having tested something, from having failed with it, from having had it break in your hands and then having rebuilt it better, from having seen it work in conditions that weren't controlled, in rooms that weren't friendly, in moments that didn't accommodate. Habit comes from repetition, from saying the same thing enough times that it starts to feel true, from moving through a pattern so many times that the pattern begins to feel like understanding. These two things feel almost identical, from the inside, until the moment they don't. And that moment, that exact moment, is what was happening, in real time, in the space between one sentence and the next, in the barely measurable pause between a man who thought he knew something and a man who was beginning to understand that knowing and believing are not always the same country. Bruce Lee remained still, and the stillness did something that no correction ever could. It held a space open, an unresolved space, the kind that the mind cannot close on its own, because the mind is very good at closing things, very good at finding an explanation that fits, very good at building a small narrative. He's distracted, he's just watching, he's thinking about something else that allows the discomfort to dissolve before it has done its work. But when the source of the discomfort is the absence of something, the mind has nothing to argue with. You can't debate an absence, you can't challenge it, can't explain it away, can't find the angle that makes it fit. You can only feel it, and keep going, and feel it more. The man kept going, Voice still steady, words still arriving, rhythm still moving forward. But the interior was quieter now, listening harder, feeling the weight of each word as it landed, noticing for the first time in the conversation the gap between what he said and what he actually understood. Not a large gap, not an obvious one, but a gap, the kind that only becomes visible when something very still stands nearby and doesn't fill it. Because the thing about gaps in understanding the genuinely interesting, deeply frustrating thing is that most of the time, the people around us fill them before we ever see them. With a nod, with an with a response that assumes the understanding was there and moves past the point. And so the gap never has to be faced. It stays hidden, not out of anyone's cruelty, just out of the momentum of conversation, which never stops long enough to let the gap show. But this moment had stopped, or rather, it had slowed. In that particular way that moments slow when something in the situation refuses to keep pace, and in that slowing, the gap became visible, not to everyone, only to the man who had been speaking, only to the person who had been standing in the space he thought he owned, only to the one who had, a few minutes earlier, felt completely certain. He finished the thought he was on, didn't cut it short, didn't abandon it, let it run to its natural end. But the end was quieter than the beginning, not weaker, not exactly, just more honest, more careful, more aware of its own edges. The room was still, Bruce Lee was still, and the man stood in a kind of silence that had nothing to do with sound, because the silence wasn't external, it was internal, the silence of a structure that has just recognized its own limits, not with embarrassment, not with collapse, just with a clear, cold, exact awareness. That awareness, that moment where the mind stops performing and just sees, is rarer than people think. Most people never reach it. Not because they're not intelligent, not because they're not capable, but because the world is very good at confirming things that aren't quite ready to be confirmed. Because nods come early. Because approval arrives before understanding is complete. Because the social machinery of conversation is built to keep moving, not to pause long enough to test whether what's moving is actually solid. And so most people go through years, sometimes entire careers, holding structures that have never been tested, believing things that have never been challenged, living in spaces that have never been measured, not out of dishonesty, out of the simple fact that nobody ever stood in the room with the quality of stillness that Bruce Lee carried, that specific, unborrowed stillness, the kind that doesn't give you anything to push against, the kind that doesn't tell you you're wrong, the kind that simply is, and in simply being, makes space for you to finally, quietly, hear yourself. This is the rarest of gifts, and it is almost never recognized as one. In the moment, it feels like discomfort, like the subtle wrongness of a floor that gives slightly under your foot, like the strange vertigo of reaching for something solid and finding it less solid than you expected. It doesn't feel like learning. It doesn't feel like progress. It feels like something being taken away, but what's being taken away was never really yours. It was borrowed from the room, from the reactions, from the steady stream of small confirmations that every conversation offers to the person who is saying something that sounds like it makes sense. Strip all of that away. Stand in the silence of someone who doesn't confirm, doesn't deny, doesn't offer any of the usual coordinates, and what you're left with is only what you actually have, only what you actually understand, only what you actually know. And sometimes that's less than you thought, and that's not a failure. That's the beginning of something real, because real understanding, the kind that holds in rooms where nobody nods, in moments where nobody confirms, in conversations where the person across from you offers nothing but presence, that kind of understanding is earned. It can't be borrowed. It can't be built from repetition alone. It has to be tested against something that doesn't move just because you want it to, against something like silence, against something like stillness, against something like a man who doesn't need to correct you because he knows that the correction is already happening in the space between your certainty and the quiet reality of what you actually hold. The man walked away from that room with fewer certainties than he walked in with. That sounds like loss. And in the first few hours, it felt like loss. But then something changed. Not dramatically, not with revelation. Just the slow, gradual recognition that the certainties he had lost were costing him something, were costing him the ability to actually listen, were costing him the curiosity that makes learning possible, were costing him the openness that a person only carries when they still believe the space in front of them might hold something they don't yet know. Certainty closes that space. It fills it with what you already have. And there's something satisfying about a filled space. Something comfortable, something settled. But nothing new can enter a space that's already full. Bruce Lee understood this, in a way that wasn't taught or studied or arrived at through instruction, in the way that some understanding is only ever arrived at through the accumulation of everything, every sparring session, every moment of failure, every time the thing that should have worked didn't, every time the technique that looked right in practice dissolved in the reality of contact. He had been wrong enough times to know what wrongness felt like before it announced itself. He had been corrected by reality enough times to understand that reality doesn't announce its corrections in advance. It just presents itself and waits. And what you do in that waiting, how honest you are, how quiet you can become, how willing you are to let go of the structure that was making you comfortable, that's the test. That's always the test. The forms don't matter. The vocabulary doesn't matter. The ease of explanation doesn't matter. What matters is what you actually carry, what holds, what survives contact with something real, because everything else is preparation. Everything else is rehearsal, and rehearsal is not the thing. The thing is, the moment when the room stops confirming and just watches, when the air holds still, when the presence in front of you asks nothing, offers nothing, confirms nothing, and what you said in that moment is the only honest answer to the question of whether you know, whether you actually know, or whether you believed that you knew. And there's a country between those two places, a wide, sometimes beautiful, often lonely country, and almost everyone is living in it, without knowing, because knowing requires the kind of mirror that most rooms don't have. The kind Bruce Lee carried without announcing, without performing, without teaching. Just by being still in the particular way, that stillness becomes its own kind of instruction. He never said the man was wrong. He never indicated it. Never leaned in with the slight forward motion of someone who has spotted something worth correcting. Never offered the quiet smile that says, "I see what you think you're doing." Nothing, just presence. Just the specific weight of a man who has done the actual work, standing in proximity to a man who had done something that resembled it, and letting the resemblance be its own answer. Because resemblance, when held next to the real thing, begins to notice itself. Not because anyone points, but because the contrast exists, and contrast, in silence, does what argument in noise never can. It simply shows. The man would spend days afterward replaying the conversation, not looking for the moment he failed. There wasn't one he could find. Not looking for the moment Bruce Lee corrected him, because that moment never came. He was looking for something harder to locate, the exact place where he had crossed from knowing into performing knowing. And the strange thing he discovered in all that replaying was that the crossing had happened quietly. Not all at once, not in a single moment of compromise or impatience or laziness, but gradually, the way all quiet crossings happen, through repetition, through the slow accumulation of confirmation, through the comfortable rhythm of being understood by rooms that weren't equipped to understand whether the understanding was earned. And he had taken the comfort of that rhythm and built a structure on top of it. A structure that looked like knowledge, that functioned like knowledge, that moved through conversation with the ease and fluency of knowledge, but that had never been tested against the thing knowledge needs to be tested against: reality. Contact, the unborrowed stillness of someone who actually knows. He understood this clearly 3 days later, in a moment of quiet that had nothing to do with Bruce Lee and everything to do with what the encounter had left behind. And he didn't know whether to feel grateful or embarrassed. He felt both, in equal measure. And then, slowly, over the weeks that followed, he began to feel something else. Lighter, not because he knew more, because he was no longer carrying the weight of certainty that hadn't been earned. Because the structure he had built, and that had quietly collapsed in that room, it had been heavy, not in a way he had noticed while carrying it, but in the way you only notice the weight of something when you've finally put it down. That's the strange arithmetic of false certainty. It doesn't feel heavy. It feels like confidence. It feels like ground, but it's not ground. It's the appearance of ground. And the appearance of ground, when trusted completely, costs you the ability to feel what's actually beneath your feet. He started over, not dramatically, not publicly, quietly, the way real starts happen. He went back to the things he thought he understood and held them with less certainty, turned them over, found the edges, found the places where his fluency had been paper thin, found the questions he hadn't known to ask because he had been too busy answering. And for the first time in a long time, the space in front of him felt open, not empty, not frightening, just open. The way a space feels when it still has room for something new. That's the gift Bruce Lee gave, without giving it, without intending it, without ever saying a word that pointed toward it. Just by standing in the room, with the particular quality of presence that true understanding carries, and letting everything that wasn't quite real begin to recognize itself. Because that's what true understanding does. It doesn't announce itself. It doesn't compete. It doesn't correct. It simply exists, in its exact, unperformed, unborrowed form. And in that existence, it becomes a kind of mirror, the most honest kind, the kind nobody can argue with, the kind that doesn't reflect what you want to see, only what's actually there. And sometimes, what's actually there is less than you thought. And sometimes, that is exactly enough to change everything. Not loudly, not all at once, just quietly, in the space between a sentence and the next, in the barely visible pause where certainty was and something more honest arrived to take its place. That's where it happens. Not in the correction, not in the challenge, not in the dramatic moment that makes for a clean story. In the silence, in the stillness, in the room where nothing changed, and nothing was ever quite the same again. He never forgot it. Not the words because there were none, not the correction because it never came, just the feeling. That specific, irreversible feeling of standing in a space you thought you owned and realizing quietly, privately, with no audience, that you had been renting, and that the landlord had just walked in, not to evict you, not to criticize the way you'd arranged the furniture, just to be present, just to exist in the space in the particular way that the person who actually owns something exists in it, without performance, without effort, without the slightly raised quality that comes from trying to project something you aren't quite sure you have. Just presence, the real kind. That costs nothing to maintain because it was never built on anything borrowed. And in the presence of that, everything built on borrowed things begins to feel exactly like what it is. Borrowed. There's a word for the moment when you realize this. Not a dramatic word. Not the kind that gets carved into stone or repeated at the beginning of speeches. Just a word. Honest. That's the word. The moment of honesty. The quiet one. The private one. The one that nobody gives you a medal for and nobody needs to know about. The one that happens in the space between a man who is speaking and the awareness that arrives slowly and without announcement. That speaking is not the same as knowing. That fluency is not the same as depth. That comfort is not the same as ground. That the room confirming you is not the same as the truth confirming you. That's the lesson. Not delivered, not taught, not explained, just demonstrated. By presence, by stillness, by a man who had done the real work, standing quietly in a room full of the appearance of work and saying nothing. Because nothing needed to be said, the silence was enough. The silence was everything. And in that everything, in that single, unspoken, uncorrected, quietly devastating everything, the man finally heard himself. For the first time, clearly, without the comfort of confirmation, without the noise of approval, without anything between himself and the exact, honest truth of what he actually held. And what he held was the beginning, not the middle, not the end. The beginning, which is exactly where the real work starts. Not when you think you already know, but when you're honest enough to see that you don't. Not fully, not yet, and maybe not ever, but closer, always closer. If you're willing to stand in the room without the borrowed certainty, if you're willing to hear the silence, if you're willing to let the mirror show you exactly what's there, without argument, without defense, without the small, comfortable story you've been telling yourself about how far you've come, just what is actually present, what is actually understood, what actually holds. That's the test, always. And it never announces itself. It just arrives, quietly, in a room where nothing changes. And yet, after that moment, nothing is ever quite the same.